Alors, bonjour, bonsoir.
Bonjour. Bonsoir. Voilà. Oui, enfin, c'est...
Alors, bonjour Luisa Passerini.
Bonjour.
Donc, je suis Florence Descamps. Je vais faire un très court résumé de l'après-midi, de la séance de cet après-midi, où il a été question, comme vous pouvez l'imaginer.
Est-ce que vous me voyez bien? Oui.
Voilà, nous vous voyons très bien.
Merci.
Donc, quelques mots de la séance de cet après-midi qui a essayé d'articuler, comme il était prévisible, les relations entre histoire et mémoire.
Oui.
À propos de mai 68. Donc ce que l'on peut retenir des 4-5 communications que nous avons entendues, c'est d'abord, j'allais dire, du côté de l'histoire orale, donc la recherche de faits ou d'informations qui vont rebondir et qui vont permettre d'épaissir en fait la connaissance historique. Donc il a été question par exemple des soviets de la Sorbonne pendant mai 68, cette expression des soviets qui a permis ensuite de faire une petite enquête sur ces différents groupes effervescents qui s'étaient créés à la Sorbonne. On peut voir aussi du côté de la recherche des connaissances, de la recherche de l'information plus fine et en même temps épaissie. J'ai retenu dans la communication des 2 universitaires de Clermont-Ferrand la porosité entre les différents milieux étudiants, paysans, ouvriers, religieux. Des milieux qu'on pourrait avoir tendance à opposer, par exemple le mouvement étudiant d'un côté, le mouvement ouvrier de l'autre. En fait, les 2 communications qui sont fondées sur l'histoire orale permettent de montrer les circulations d'idées entre un milieu et l'autre. Donc une sorte de construction mémorielle autour de ces faits qui permettent aussi, dans un deuxième temps, d'appréhender les jugements de valeur, les croyances, les représentations, toutes choses qui se transmettent cette fois-ci du côté de la mémoire. Donc il y a en quelque sorte un continuum et pas d'opposition entre histoire et mémoire. Donc dans le cas de la mémoire, il me semble on a très bien vu dans la communication des chercheurs italiens d'un côté, mais aussi de Simon Ridley pour le cas américain de Berkeley, l'émergence de mythologie, mythologie au sens positif et constructif du terme, notamment avec les leaders. J'ai retenu l'expression italienne, les étoiles. Il y avait des étoiles. Si j'ai bien entendu. Donc j'ai compris que c'était les leaders charismatiques qui, dans la mémoire, se polarisent entre, d'un côté, la rationalité, de l'autre, la fantaisie, mais aussi peut-être le terrorisme ou la liberté, enfin des figures opposées qui structurent en fait cette mémoire des mouvements étudiants. Souligner aussi l'importance de mémoires qui ne sont pas solubles, qui ne se recomposent pas et qui restent finalement à la fois conflictuelles et qui ne se résolvent pas dans ce qu'on pourrait appeler aussi le consensus mémoriel. Enfin, dernière chose que j'ai remarquée à travers les 4 communications, c'est l'importance de la circulation des idées. Les idées qui circulent de façon chronologique et verticale, par exemple les références par exemple dans le cas de Potemkin, évidemment à la révolution, à la situation russe, puis on va passer à 1936 pour l'Espagne, et puis la guerre d'Algérie pour le cas français par exemple. Donc une circulation d'idées dans la chronologie historique, et puis des circulations d'idées bien sûr dans les espaces internationaux, avec des circulations d'idées des États-Unis à la France, de la France à la Grèce, etc. etc. Voilà en quelques mots les communications qui nous ont été présentées, et ça n'est qu'une toute petite partie de ce que nous avons évoqué, et pardon de résumer aussi mal.
Non, merci beaucoup Florence, c'est vraiment très très précieux pour mon exposé, ma conversation avec Kostis, et toutefois il me fait regretter encore plus que je ne suis là, je n'étais pas là, donc peut-être il pourrait lire plus tard les communications s'il y en aura, et donc merci encore. Merci.
Alors maintenant, je laisse la parole à votre interlocuteur pour...
non, alors un moment, parce que je dois me remercier aussi des autres, c'est-à-dire le GERM, la Cité des mémoires étudiantes, le Centre d'histoire des infos qui m'ont invité, et surtout Rémi Maubert, Jean-Philippe Lebois et Johanna Casapi, et Kostis, bien sûr, avec qui on a commencé cette conversation il y a longtemps. Nous avons choisi de parler anglais parce que nos recherches dans ce champ sont en anglais et c'est notre langue de travail. Peut-être c'est regrettable, mais en tout cas pour le moment c'est comme ça, for good and evil.
Exactly. Okay, so hello again, Luisa, and welcome. I would like to start with a general question about your work, but also about your life. You have worked on student movements in your academic work, but you were also a member of student movements in Turin. You were a feminist. You were a radical. Then you were part of the Frelimo anti-colonial movements in Mozambique. So my first question is, could you tell us more about this mixture? So how did such disparate ideas coexist within a movement or within a person like yourself? So say something about the different political and geographical contexts that you found yourself in.
Well, thank you, Kostis, for this question. It's not so easy, but actually you mentioned two crucial terms, the person, the individual, and the movement. There was not yet a real movement in the mid-60s, but when I was sort of 24, 25, but there was a sense of movement of ideas, and these ideas were sort of finding a point of crossing, of encounter within certain individuals. There was a strong sense of minority. At the time, I was in contact and constituting a sort of small group with 4 other persons in Turin and Milan, so it was really very small. but there was an almost not totally conscious resistance and revolt on our part, which was then called, when we found the words through the Situationist International, it was a sort of revolution of daily life. And what we did were very small things, like rebellion to the family, going home very late at night, especially for a girl, that was really terrible. Everything was forbidden to girls, to young women, like wearing trousers, smoking. Smoking in the road was particularly terrible, and so this way of rebelling was very minor. Perhaps the practice of sexual freedom was a real break, and that was one of the strong points of our daily revolt. So it was mainly, or for instance, for boys not wearing a tie. I know this may sound really very minor. It was not at the time, it was somehow scandalous. By the way, if you see the photographs of the Italian 68, many of the young men in the universities are still wearing a tie at the beginning. And anyway, at the same time, we were also anti-imperialist. Cuba was important, and the liberation movement in Africa were very important. And so all this sort of this confused rebellion during daily life, because life was unbearable. Life was really very, what the sociologists said in terms of anomic, apathetic, was the sense of that nothing was happening, and then we tried to make something happen, at least in our small. So so in the end we ended up meeting the situation, is going to Paris, going to Strasbourg, translating into Italian the De la misère au milieu étudiant. Actually, we never entered the Situation International because we were very afraid of being thrown out. And everybody was being thrown out, like in Piedmont, the painter Pinot Galizio and so on. But anyway, in spite of all this, I also was trying to finish a thesis in the philosophy of history, and which was on the concept of historical crisis in Henri de Saint-Simon and which I actually did, but I refused to publish it out of coherence, don't publish in the capitalist press. When we translated De la misère au milieu étudiant for Feltrinelli, we wanted no copyright, and Feltrinelli was very pleased with this because he had to put no money. Anyway, as I said, I was strongly third worldist and anti-imperialist, so I decided with two of my comrades to go to East Africa. And I worked with the liberation movement, especially Frente de Libertação de Mozambique, for a year, with and on. I finally published a book on this movement, and then I went back to Italy and participated in the student worker movement around the Fiat, which was sort of the end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s, for the whole first half of the 70s, and well, it was the long 68 in Italy.
Yeah. Thank you. That you focus on 68, and since we are commemorating the 50 years now, Alain Badiou has claimed that we commemorate and think and rethink of 68 because we believe that nothing is at stake anymore, that somehow it is dead, hence we look at it as trivial. We think of it as a failure, and because we don't think it's anymore politically relevant. So I wonder, how would you comment on this? And if you think that there are still connections with the present in terms of politics, society, ideology, life?
I would not use the term failure. I would definitely use the term defeat. I think we lost. And actually this defeat was very visible to me the first time in, as I say, with first half of the 70s, when the white collars at Fiat descended on the streets to show their disagreements with the workers. And there were 40,000 white collars in the streets protesting. And that was the end, the end of that porosité of which Florence was referring, the connection between different movements, different milieux. It was saying, we are with the boss, we are with Fiat. And so it was a very clear defeat. And yes, of course it has repercussions in the present. To me, this was expressed very well in the book The Nouvel Esprit du Capitalisme by Waltensky and Chapelot. The perversion of 68, the perverse results, like mostly, I think, the flexibility of work that resulted from the request to free work became a flexibility of work, which means total precariousness, total power, and total instability of the working force. It was very evident, 2 days ago at the 1st of May, in the usual demonstration, what was very evident was that the new type of participation were these workers who have no status. Sometimes they work 1 day, 2 days. So, and also sex. I mean, the idea of sexual freedom was transformed, perverted into the idea of the total commerciality of sex and love, perhaps, to some extent. Not only in money terms, but also in terms of political and cultural exchange. So, yes, a defeat, and I remember Stuart Hall said that once. He said, oral history was born of a defeat, because it is literally true. We stopped going to the factories with leaflets and started going to the workers with tape recorder. So it's a particular defeat in a way. It's not you know. It's a defeat that also brought many novelties.
Yeah.
But politically it was a defeat. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this in my own interviews with Spanish and Greek activists from the 60s, this idea comes out as well of the defeat. But I think somehow the contexts are different. So this idea of defeating the fascist regimes, the dictatorships, and so on is something that is still considered to be a huge conquest. You know, I have like historian Antonis Liakos in mind, for example. But these are also people who canalized or channeled their dynamism in their work. So I'll try to focus on your work and on memory. We've been discussing memory before, as Florence told you, in this summary. And I would like to go back to your book on Autobiography of a Generation, on the 68 generation, and in which you were trying to remember and to work and recollect actually a past that you also shared. And this was a qualitative move or leap from your previous work on fascism and the working classes in Turin. And I remember that you said at some point that the uneducated working class people that you interviewed for Torino Operaia very often were much more articulated in the interviews than the highly educated people from the 68 generation that you interviewed. So I wonder if you could elaborate on this.
No, that is absolutely true. The workers I had interviewed who had memories of fascism were not illiterate. They had many of them had a political culture, especially the communists. Many of them also had remnants of the great peasant culture of which Bakhtin has written for centuries old. But they did not have most of the time a written culture, and when I showed them the transcripts of my interviews with them, they just said, I don't care about that. I rather listen to some of my words on your tape recorder, but not read the transcript. All completely the other way around. The 68ers corrected every comment, every word of their transcripts. But their way of narrating was much less artful. And I spoke with a friend of mine, Gianni Cerati, who's a writer, a scholar of language, and he said, yes, because schooling has destroyed the capacity of narration. So this was one of the things I meant, I think, yeah. But also perhaps, this was, you were talking about my life. At the time of Autobiography of a Generation, my life had really changed very much, because I produced a book on, as you said, on the working class, and then I was taken by the sense of the meaning, lack of meaning of this dispersed life, this fragmented life. So I started psychoanalysis, and I started collecting my own memory and a memory of my contemporaries. So it was a transition in a personal and and collective sense. It was like, actually it was finding a we subject, we plural.
Yeah, this connects well, I think, to my next question, which has to do with something I can see Jean-Philippe holding the book, actually. It's The Student Generation in Revolt by Ronald Fraser. That you
Here I have it.
You have it there in a different edition. So you collaborated in this, and I think this was a bit like the foundation of your work, or your interviews for Autobiography of a Generation. So we know that you weren't very content with the final outcome, and I wanted to ask you if you could share with us the methodological and the theoretical issues that you had, or I don't know, didn't you like the way in which different countries were grouped together? Tell us what was the problem?
I was critical, and many of us were, but the thing was that, you know, we had found money through publishers to finance, to fund the part of the research, collecting the interviews in 5 countries, United States, France, Italy, Germany and Britain, and meeting once in a while during the collection, and that was really wonderful. I mean, these meetings were, but this was the collection. And then there was no time left and no money left to discuss all this. So there was a division of labor, and I wanted to read just 2 words by Fraser. Fraser did a great job because he was a great writer, good oral historian, but the division of labor was such that he had a very heavy responsibility. As he says at the end of the introduction here, he says, the selection of materials from all the countries and the form and structure of the book are my responsibility. It was not ours. It was not possible. So he took upon himself this hard task. But this would not reflect a collective discussion. It didn't go deep. And especially, it did not. It was all right as a description and facts concerning 175 interviewees, which is not a small thing. But something he says that we wanted to do, to go over the absence of a collective assessment of what the movements achieved and what they failed to achieve, as what he says in the introduction, was not done. So we didn't do this, and it was a division of labor. Perhaps it was part of the. We were out of the academic system, and we were out of the funding system. So we could not. It was largely voluntary work, and so it's like unfinished, and especially one point, which I think Kostis is very much also point of your work, is the fact that the relationship, the communication between the countries, that circulation of ideas that Florence was reporting, was discussed today, that remained a sort of mystery, and we didn't really understand how it took place. I think it is still understudied. So there are many things this book didn't do, but you know, it has repercussions. It may have consequences. First of all, it is true that Autobiography of a Generation grew out of it, and very recently, this might interest the Italian participants in this conference, I still have all this material, and since one of us, a very brilliant man, Luigi Bobbio, recently died, a friend of mine and myself have edited his long interview, and we'll publish it as a booklet. So in this year of, of 50th anniversary, with much blah blah, we'll bring this small booklet with a voice from then. So things are unfinished. They go, but they may go on.
Yeah, that's great. It's somehow it's material that gets re-elaborated over time. So I want to refer to another book of yours, with the Storie di donne femministe, in which you argue that there is a discontinuity between the message of 68 and what comes before and after, that somehow there is a distance between the ideological Marxism of the 1960s, the attempts to build organizations later, the violence of the 1970s, and so on. In contrast to that, my feeling also when I was living in Italy, in terms of the media, the kind of public history that was created about the 1968 was of this decennial, right, of these 10 years as a continuum, a decade. So I would like you to comment on that if you can. How do you see this?
Yes, discontinuity is absolutely the right word. If we don't have this term and this concept, I don't think we can understand 68 and its environment. I think that, in fact, as I was saying, in a way, nobody figured out, nobody could foresee 68, and it was an eruption of subjectivity. And then that jump, the jump of history, which is due to people becoming subjects of their own lives, was, again, there was another jump, which was the jump to terrorism, but it was a regression. It was, I mean, I don't know whether, there are really progress and regression in history, but anyway, it was taking literally what the imagination had brought to power. It was literal violence rather than symbolic violence. It was a discontinuity. It was breaking with the hopes. This was the part of the defeat, the terrorism. I mean, or as they called it, the armed struggle in a so almost democratic, largely democratic countries. So the fact of it's very difficult to understand, even for us historians, the discontinuity of history. By the way, it is essential to understand it in order to talk about Europe today. We cannot think of European history as a continuum. But it is true that it's one of the dangers of life stories, because life stories are a continuum, but history is not. And as you say, the media reflect the continuity more than understand, And for there's now, I was really upset by, there is a media program, a TV program now, which is called Le Ragazze del 68, the girls of 68. And of course it has some good parts. It's built on interviews with women who are now my age or slightly younger. But first of all, I resent very much pulling together all the women under the girls of 68. And the condition of women in the 68 movements, and there were links with the feminist movement coming out of it in part, were very different. It's not true that there was only, that women only had a subordinate status, and it was, every case was very different. Even the relationship between the 68 movement and feminism changes a lot. It's multifarious, it's multiplicity. So this is discontinuity. Discontinuity also, perhaps if I can use what Florence was saying, not only vertical, not only in the sense of one movement after the other, after a break, but also horizontally, the multiplicity of individuals, away, and places. I mean, every university in Italy has a different 68, but very, very different. Milan was very different from Turin, and which was very close, for instance, to Strasbourg and situation in inspiration. But you have something to say on this, I suppose.
No, I mean this idea of the long 68 is intriguing also for other cases. Like, for example, I don't know if we look at the Greek case, because it's in 1973. We have this idea of the extended 68 as well. But in my work, I found Arthur Marwick's term of the long 60s to be a little bit more useful. this idea of this extended stretch decade from the early 60s, but only up to the mid-70s, so only up to 73 or 74, because I have the impression that then with the oil crisis and so on, and the fall of the dictatorships in Greece and Spain and Portugal, it really creates a very, very different landscape. So it would be difficult to imagine this idea of a long 68 that reaches until the late 1970s. This is a little bit my feeling.
But I also what you're saying now makes me sort of think of something I have never really figured out completely clearly, which is when you said, of course you say in your own book, well, 68 in Greece took place in 73. Something which is absolutely an oxymoron. But we also say, 68 in Berkeley happened in 1964. This is one of the historical problems. How do we understand this global dimension, which at the same time is very localized? This I don't think we have done enough.
Right, absolutely. We were just talking about Berkeley right before, actually. So it's a bridge. I wanted to ask you about a special issue on Thesis 11. It was a very interesting issue. You participated, Peter Wagner, Paul Ginsburg, and so on. And I remember that in your contribution, you referred to Francesco Alberoni's idea of a collective falling in love in the movement, which I found the same idea being reverberated in other contexts. So I think there have been many misconceptions regarding the sexual revolution, the so-called sexual revolution, right? In 68, the general affective liberation of your generation, and I wanted you to comment on the hidden and the private and the the non-verbal personal experience. There are some people who talked about oppression through liberation, right? So this kind of, again, the oxymoron of this liberation. I don't know what you feel. I have the impression that testimonies tend to be very contradictory about that issue too. Right.
I have collected testimonies of women who became very radical feminists, and they resented very much the sort of freedom which was imposed in the movement. I mean, the student movement and the worker movement. But this was one position. I am sure, and I also refer to the experience of myself and other women, that the elements of oppression which were within the liberation, sexual liberation and love liberation, were largely our own choice. I wanted to be against jealousy. I wanted to be free. I wanted to have many sexual experiences, and which means that sometimes they were not great fun, but it was an intellectual position, a political position. So it's ridiculous to just say, as we hear now sometimes, but the leaders were always men and the women were always subordinate and the men decided everything. It's just a rough description. It is true that years later, when there was a real feminist movement, because the form of liberation which took place during 68 was not feminist, of course. But when it took place, it sort of disrupted the old organizations. But the organizations, meaning Lotta Continua and so on, these were not the 68. These were the crystallization of 68. And so I think this question of, but look, I think that even in the feminist movement, we did we did to some extent decide that certain things were to be done in terms of sexual liberation. The language was no longer that, it was no longer the same, but the idea, for instance, of the freedom to have love stories and sexual stories with other women. This was not only a gut feeling, as Company says. This was a decision of the mind, a political decision. And it has been said very clearly also. So,
yeah. I want to, since we keep using the term generation, I want to go back to that term, very contested term, but we still use it. I think in this country, in particular, the famous volumes by Vermont and Patrick Rothman, Génération, somehow they created an entire interpretative frame of 68. And even newer studies like Julie Pagis, who works on microgeneration, somehow it's again a re-elaboration of the same term. So my question is, do you think the concept is still valid? And in terms of Italy, do you think there is a book that is equivalent of Génération by Amon and Rothman?
No, there isn't. There isn't. That's a great book. I remember my friend and comrade Daniel Berthaud saying it was a great book, and I agree. No, we don't have anything like that. One reason, I think, is that Italy has still living through a cancellation of memory, collective memory. In connection with the terrorist movement, it has always been very hard, very tough to accept that there has been a sort of left violent terrorist movement. And also, there have always been ambivalent feelings. Still, the media privilege those who were in the Red Brigades and Prima Linea, and the relatives of the victims of the Red terrorists have come out very strongly saying that this is still the case. For instance, the son of Calabresi, the police officer who was assassinated because of being suspected of being involved with the death, the murder of Giuseppe Pinelli, the anarchist who was accused of being part of the massacre. I mean, this mixture of terrible things and the ideals of the left has not been elaborated collectively, and still today, things happen. Like one of the women who was in the commando that actually not only. Which actually killed Aldo Moro, the Christian Democrat. She still has spoken in TV accusing the victims of posing as victims, the relatives of the victims. And so it's a very divided, it's a divided memory, it's not a collective memory. So and also, I mean, generation, I mean, the generation of 68 is not the whole generation. This is not a biological concept. It's a political concept. Some of us went through all that, others did not. And so, yeah, I think we mentioned, you and I already talked about Stuart Hilwig, the young scholar who unfortunately died prematurely. He had collected from Ohio State University. He had collected in Italy the testimonies on 68 by professors, parents, clergy, and so on. And that was another side. So the generation is a mixture.
Yeah. I was wondering about the new generation as well. And I know that there is, I mean, in the new generations or the posterior generations to 68, a mixture of fascination and extreme criticism, or this idea of being polemic with 68. New generations, they need to somehow express their in their own genuine revolts. So I was wondering what's happening with the memory of 68. Betta and Capussotti have talked about this, the potential of old memories liberating somehow a new dynamism, a new potential. You call the memories of the new generations about the 68 indirect memories. We could also use the term post-memory by Marion Hirsch. So the generational transmission of memory, I think that's where I'm going at. And let me be a little bit more specific. I know that recently there was a meeting of the feminist group in Florence, the feminist group going back to the 70s, and somehow there were 3 different generations discussing, right, about feminism. So people from the 30s, 50s, and 60s intervened. And Enrica Capussotti posed the question whether new memories can be produced. So I was wondering if you can talk about this communication between these different generations. How was it? And what do you think about this question about new memories?
Yes, it's a really crucial question. It's also a sore point. You put your finger on the sore point. Because actually, well, first of all, generation is an imprecise term. When for instance, how should I say, traditionally, in old sociology, traditional sociology, generation was supposed to be sort of 20-25 years, and then a difference. And in age. And then the idea of cohort, the notion of cohort was used, which is much more flexible and malleable, because it's 6, 5, 8 years, and it works somehow better. But the whole question is, as one of my American students, you want us to close? Shall we?
Should we get directly to... On commence les débats tout de suite?
Yes.
Okay.
On a plus que 5 minutes.
Shall I just finish this reply?
Yes.
Okay. The question is the following. Some of my own students actually said that we, generation of 68, had appropriated memory and had claimed that only direct experience was the true foundation of memory, and they thought there was a different memory of 68 that could transmit. I agree on this, and the fact, however, this is one aspect. The other aspect, the new memories, I really don't see much of new memories around. Except, I must say that the only time when I had the sense of a new memory being created was when I listened to Benny Tai from Hong Kong in 2015, who gave a speech about their ideas there. And I had the feeling that Occupy Central in Hong Kong really had been building a new memory. But of course, what is happening now with them? I mean, for instance, I read today in the South China Morning, what's the title of the newspaper, that he is being harassed and persecuted very much. So this new memory is at risk.
Yeah. Great. Thank you so much. I don't know. We're going to turn the screen so that that the audience can make a question. So we're going to skip the final question on archives, but that's fine. I think we covered most of our material. So okay, let's.
Hello. Hi.
So, hello. Je remontre les livres, moi c'est l'édition.
Ah, mais vous avez l'autre édition, c'est-à-dire Angleterre et États-Unis sont deux éditions
américaine. Et là c'est le mouvement social. Je vais les montrer aux collègues.
Voilà.
Parce que du coup, donc là, vous voyez, c'est l'enquête orale internationale. où il y a eu... alors il y avait aussi l'Irlande du Nord.
C'est vrai, c'est vrai.
Non, je le dis parce que Chris Reynolds n'est pas là, mais on a un chercheur anglais qui est en train de recueillir des témoignages sur l'Irlande du Nord, donc c'est intéressant. Et donc là, dans le mouvement social, vous avez aussi, donc c'est Luisa qui l'avait coordonné, et vous avez des articles de Daniel Berthaud, Béatrix Levita, Daniel Linhart pour la France, Passerini pour l'Italie évidemment, et vous avez Annette Troger pour l'Allemagne, qui avait participé aussi. Et ce qui est intéressant, c'est que, c'est pour ça que je transmets, je ne sais pas dans quel sens je fais, voilà, comme ça, je transmets donc à Luisa officiellement, parce que je lui en ai parlé tout à l'heure, le regret de Daniel Berthaud, non seulement de ne pas être là hier, mais de ne pas être là aussi aujourd'hui, parce que 30 ans après, il donne toujours raison à Luisa sur leur débat par rapport à ce livre sur l'enquête orale de 68, parce que lui, en tout cas, il se souvenait que la critique de Luisa, c'était que la partie française, c'était trop de l'histoire bataille. C'était trop uniquement des événements et qu'il n'y avait pas la prise en compte de la subjectivité. Donc voilà. C'est juste pour lancer le débat.
Je précise ce message par Daniel. En effet, il faut dire qu'en premier lieu, je ne me souvenais pas de cette histoire, mais c'est vrai. Et en effet, je pense qu'après tout, pourtant, le mouvement social, ce mouvement social-là, reflète cette tension entre les deux approches.
Absolument. Donc, je laisse la parole au reste de l'assistance pour enrichir le débat, si vous le souhaitez.
One question.
Yes, Johanna.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup encore une fois. So, one question. In fact, the archives or your life stories are one of the best ways to approach 68. Where are you now in terms of oral depositories? It is or not? Both of you, you and Kostis. Stored your interviews at home instead of giving them to an institutional archive center. Is there a way of this impasse, or wasn't the creation of an oral history database a desired objective of oral historians 30 years ago?
Joanna, this is another short point, because in fact, the story of my own oral history collection is a sad one. All the material I collected on the memory of fascism, I gave to the University of Turin, thinking that a public institution would be the best place. And they lost it. They lost the whole stuff. They put it in a sort of basement, and then it was flooded, and then it was thrown away. So so the material on 60. Actually, I gave to one foundation in Turin the material I collected orally in the jail. I had a long, sort of 6 months of interviews with women who had previously been part of Red Brigades and Prima Linea. So all the material on this part has been given to the Fondazione Nocentini in Turin, and they have been very careful in not making it completely available, but keeping part of it private, because you see, this is very delicate material. So you have to find somebody who is ready to ask for permission every time and so on. And also, I think they did a very good job, but I have not yet brought myself to give the material on 68 to any foundation, because it's much larger. It is much larger. It is much also, it concerns many people who are still around, but also people who have died, unfortunately. So there is a serious problem of who has the right to this material. And there is no experience, not enough experience in the field of audiovisual archives. But I think I must do something very soon. And there are certain centers in Italy, the Instituto de Martino, the Circolo Gianni Bosio, the Centro Gobetti, and this Fondazione Nocentini, who do have some oral material, but there is no real large center for all this, and I think this is a major problem. Right. The archive, because the archive is, especially this kind of archive, it covers the problem of how should I say? Which is the source? We originally, at the beginning of doing oral history, we originally thought the source was the transcript, but of course it isn't. The source is the tape or the video. Today is largely video, but then in the end I think the source is really the interview itself, the corporeal meeting between, the encounter between two people. So how do you have these days we largely have video interviews most of the time, which makes the problem, my present research about the memory of migrants to Europe. But we have got a large, for this research on memory of migrants, memory of Europe, we have got a large grant from the European Research Council, and we are going to deposit everything at the archives, historical archives of the European Union. But 68 is not so interesting. I did offer them, but I don't know, Kostis, whether you have a similar experience.
You mean I didn't have like an official institution trying to get my interviews. There was the social history archives in Athens, who at some point expressed interest, but then we're still negotiating, let's say, because they never really launched their oral history series. So that's the problem. There is always this idea that archives will expand their collections with oral histories, and somehow it never really works. I don't know. That's my experience, at least from Greece.
Free speech movement?
Yeah.
Free speech movement? No?
You need to be financed by some organization. The free speech movement, they had their own archives, and they did a lot of work, but they were financed by Silverstein, who gave a big gift after the death of Mario Savio. He donated millions of dollars to the University of Berkeley so that they could house the free speech movement archives, basically. So that's how that happened. And there's also a question of who has the right to the memory and who has the right to these archives. And usually it tends to be the women, so it's Lynn Holland de Savio, Mario Savio's second wife. She's a custodian of his papers, and she chooses who has access or not. So there's a very personal relation there too.
That's very interesting. Please.
Okay, I'm an archivist. I teach archival science in Trento University, and I'm a friend of the Italian Association of Oral History, AESO, led till a month ago by Giovanni Contini. Alessandro Casellato, you know very well. They were involved in defining some, criteria about how to reach materials from oral history and how to control, to preserve, and to let other historians use them. And something like good criteria, good practice. And they prepared some document in this sense, and this is diffused among oral historians. I don't know if you know this text, but I would like to know if you think that this kind of reflections about how to preserve these documents, how to preserve the privacy of the person who gave their witness to historians or historians is good as well, and how to think, to reflect about it.
No, I think they do a very precious work, and I am, I wish there were more support of this. I must also say that I have been completely inactive for what concerns the sort of oral history association. I know of their activities and I appreciate it, but I've sort of moved out of the field in practical terms. This may be one of the reasons of also my lack of organizational lack with this material, because I really moved away from what I am doing now is not really oral history. I mean, I have moved from oral history of the working class and then the 68ers and women and so on to the trying to understand what is Europe, what is European identity, and so on. And then I went into this research, which is finishing now, on the memory of migration, which is, however, visual memory. I have moved from oral to visual memory. And so that's also one of the reasons why I've been rather not active at all in the oral history movement. It is, I think that this is not the topic of our discussion tonight, but if I am allowed, I would just say that I think that some of the novelty or orality was a frontier once. It was a frontier of historiography, of understanding the history of subjectivity. I think that the new frontier is now visuality, visual memory. And so I sort of moved and I think that all the consequences of this move to visuality, which incorporates the oral, are still to be drawn.
So very much, thank you very much. We have to quitte, enfin to dire au revoir.
Merci à vous.
Thank you.
Tous et à vos fils et à Florence. Bonne soirée.
Merci beaucoup.
Grazie mille.